Alexander Solzhenitsyn, the great Russian activist and author, he said, if only it were so simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were necessarily simply to separate them from the rest of us and destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who among us is willing to destroy a piece of our heart? So in a way, what we're seeing kind of concerns some people put in the chat is really a symptom of our humanity. Here we are, 21st century, late stage capitalism, which has gotten to the place where there's further extremes of rich and poor or exploitation. And we're at the time what Joanna Macy calls the great turning, kind of the great opportunity, really, for us to reset our lives as human beings. Now, what's also true about the great turning is that it's a birth process. I don't know how many of you have given birth, but I imagine looking at the screen that some of you would raise your hands. And it's messy. It's painful. It's dangerous. It's difficult. And we are in some kind of a birth process. And all the things that we see are not just these are terrible things, but they're also symptoms of our fear as human beings. We're kind of wired to fear the other. And our politics is all about fear. The great commentators about politics, the whole aim of politics is to frighten the populace into voting for you. That was 100 years ago, that commentary. But that's not who we are at heart. That's the small, separate self, the body of fear. But the Buddhist texts also begin, O nobly born, remember who you are. Remember your fearlessness in the midst of it all. Center yourself. Thomas Jefferson said something like, one person with courage is a majority. And I used to have on my refrigerator a picture of that Chinese man with the shopping bag standing in front of that line of tanks. Remember that image? Maybe after Tiananmen Square, and the tanks stopped and he had his shopping bags. But how do we do this? We have to stay in the present, because if you let yourself get drowned by the news and the fears and the thoughts, you'll go swimming and rising and falling in the ocean of grief and fear. And that's not who you are. Meditation invites you to have a very different perspective. When a butterfly makes a chrysalis, we used to think as kids, and we were told this, that it would grow its wings, right? There's the caterpillar, and that it adds some wings and it comes out and it flies. But now we know, all the science shows us, it's something very different. It dissolves. It becomes a gelatinous mass of cells, some of which are related to the old to the old caterpillar, and some other cells which have a beautiful name. They're called Imaginal Cells. And these are the cells that picture that they can fly. What a wild thing for those cells to believe that. But honestly, they do. They carry that image, that imagination, that possibility. And apparently there's some struggle there in the chrysalis about who's going to win out. Can we go back to the old caterpillar? I don't think so. And gradually the imaginal cells begin to build the wings of the butterfly. But it's not easy. Things fall apart. And I say that lightly, but actually there can be tremendous suffering. And we can see it. Part of our practice and our training is the capacity to bear witness to the ocean of tears, as well as the wondrous glory of the world and the universe. You know, the beauty that surrounds us, and nature keeps showing us amazing things. And it keeps getting reborn no matter what you do. It will reborn. It will push through the cracks in the sidewalk. You try to pave it over, baby, it's coming back. It's just what it does. It renews itself. So there's a kind of trust that's asked. And there's a story. Remember Black Elk? Black Elk was a great medicine man of his people. And he was, celebrated. And he had this beautiful vision on Harney Peak about the circle of life. And part of the vision was the way the native people would again, his people would again come together and live in the harmony they had before. And in the beautiful biography of Black Elk Speaks, William Neihardt, who interviewed him and lived with him at the end of his life and became partly his voice, he was with Black Elk. And Black Elk was an old man now at the end of his life, as Neihardt writes. And he wanted to go back and visit the top of Harney Peak, where he was blessed by a vision of the sacred hoop of the world that inspired his whole life and so many people. And so he put on his finest headdress and painted himself as one does to meet the gods, and took a sacred pipe and asked for a blessing, honoring the goodness and beauty of the sacred tree. And he walked up the top of Harney Peak. And Neihardt said it was a clear blue sky. And yet Black Elk had told him that, in fact, if his life was any value, the rains would come. This is a very dry part of the Dakotas. But the clouds would part and bring some rain as a blessing from the Great Spirit. And he climbed up. The sky was perfectly clear. And there were tourists looking at this old man and his headdress and paint, like wondering. And it was in the midst of a season of drought, one of the worst in years. And he lay himself on the ground at the top of Harney Peak and made a prayer that if he had lived righteously, that the gods would somehow bless him with rain. And Neihardt said, to his astonishment, some clouds appeared just over that part of the mountain, and a light rain began to fall. And Black Elk lay there and smiled, and somehow knew, even though he didn't succeed in reweaving the sacred hoop in the way that he intended, that his life was not in vain. There are some bigger forces than what you know, bigger than politics, bigger than even climate change, bigger than AI. And these are all huge forces. Don't get me wrong. But in another way, they're trivial. They're trivial compared to the forces of the turning of the seasons and the return of life. As Pablo Neruda says, you can pick all the flowers, but you can't stop the spring. There's another force. And that's what we're asked to remember, something mysterious and great, and to quiet ourselves and align ourselves. And then, of course, to begin to act, but to act not in the way of fear. You know, I tell that story, I might have told it a month ago, of our colleague, my beloved friend, Wes Nisker, who died a couple of years ago, visiting Gary Snyder, the great environmentalist now in his 90s, who got the Pulitzer Prize for his environmental writing 50, 60 years ago, Earth Household, saying, Gary, the oceans are rising, the deserts are growing, refugees everywhere, animals going extinct, the ice flows melting. What advice do you have? You've been an environmentalist for more than half a century. And he looked back and he said, don't feel guilty. Don't feel guilty. If you want to save it, don't save it out of guilt. Don't save it out of fear. Don't save it out of anger. Because the guilt and the fear and the anger are what has created our human problems. This is the source of it. If you want to save it because you love it. That's the force that makes a difference. You know, that's the power that does so. So what you do when you meditate is you let yourself sit with heartbreak. How many have heartbreak? Don't bother raising your hands. We know you. How many have felt guilt or fear? Okay. And then here's Gary saying, don't save it out of fear, out of confusion and guilt, doom scrolling, all these things which will come in these times. But the end of Mary Oliver's poem about the last day of the Buddha, where he lies under the two sal trees, and his last words as the trees break into blossom, and he looks up and he says, make of yourself a light. It's usually carried like be a lamp unto yourself, but Mary Oliver's better than that. She says, make of yourself a light.